TASA supported event to make it accessible. So if you don't want your presentation recorded, just let us know before you start speaking. We can pause it really easily. So if you have any privacy or other concerns around that, we're happy to just pause it for your presentation. So I just wanted to begin by doing an acknowledgement of country. So I am privileged to live and work on the unceded lands of the Gunai people. I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Claire and Marianne are distant from me, so they are on different country.
Yes, hello, I'm Marianne Clark, and Claire and I are both speaking to you from the unceded land of the Gadigal and Bidjigal peoples, the traditional custodians of the beautiful Sydney coast. And we would like to pay our respects to elders, both past and present.
And if you are also on First Nations land, we would encourage you to pop in the chat where you're located and whose land you're on, because we are from a number of different places today, which is really exciting. And all of those places have histories beyond white colonization. All right, so I'm going to do a brief welcome now and just sort of set up why we thought a symposium on wellness scholarship would be a good idea. I'm planning to speak for about 10 minutes maybe. So Claire, if I start to go on, please just wave at me. So if you want to tweet, you can use the hashtag #BetterBody. We are all on Twitter, obviously. So I'm Dead Theorist. You can see Claire and Marian's handles here. So the point of this symposium is to sort of gather related scholarship together, which we thought was a bit fractured. When we were casting around and dreaming up this event, we thought there is a lot of different kinds of wellness scholarship out there, but it's hard to sort of all find it in the same place. So we were really keen to start bringing together a community of scholars who are all working on similar areas to pool our knowledge and think about, you know, what we could potentially create in this space, and how we could begin to account for wellness cultures sociologically. So the question is, what would a sociology of wellness look like? So I think it's quite tempting to think of wellness as being a health and fitness issue. So sometimes it gets subsumed into health scholarship or physical culture scholarship, but we also wanted to acknowledge that there's something very distinct about wellness as a social phenomena, and it covers a lot of different dimensions, right? So it's very embodied, it's very affective, it draws on our emotions and sensations. It covers misinformation, mental health, it covers sex, it's implicated in capitalism, it's driven by influences, it even covers financial advice, it concerns spirituality, it can tell us how to eat, it talks about gender, it talks about our intimate relationships, it's often very digital. And I also wanted to highlight the fact that I think there is a need for a decolonization approach to scholarship of wellness, right? Because what wellness often does is takes indigenous cultural practices and removes them from their context and their history and literally capitalizes on them for profit. So I think it's really important that we attend to sensitivities of race and ethnicity when we are talking about wellness practices, and really acknowledge that these practices don't emerge out of nowhere. They are not discovered by white people. They have long and complex cultural traditions and histories that we really should be sensitive to as we are talking about wellness cultures. So our hope is that we can develop a scholarship across a variety of these areas that is sociologically informed and analytical and critical about what these practices are and how they function in contemporary society. So we also wanted to challenge the narrative that people who engage in wellness practices are cultural dupes. So we might see this around people, buying crystals, for example, that these people are silly or misinformed or they don't understand science, and that we just need to sort of correct these behaviours in order to produce appropriate subjectivities. We instead want to ask, why is wellness engaging? So what is drawing people to wellness practices? Why are they so entrancing? And what do they offer that other sites of engagement do not? Is it because they take individual pain and distress seriously in a way that's often difficult to encounter in traditional health and well-being spaces? We're also interested in thinking about wellness in relation to pleasure. So I think there has been a tendency as wellness has become included in workplace programs and corporate programs, that the wellness discourse can turn sites of pleasure or activities that were sites of pleasure into sites of moral action. So through the wellness framework, you now have an obligation to engage in certain types of self-maintenance and self-care behaviors, rather than them being pleasurable in and of themselves. So we're also interested in thinking through if wellness practices turn sites of pleasure into sites of moral action for individuals. We're also interested in thinking about if wellness simply extends neoliberal logics of the entrepreneurial self into other areas of our life. So I am always come back to this Zizek quote when I'm thinking about like what wellness is in relation to pleasure. And he says, the very injunction to enjoy sabotages enjoyment. So that paradoxically, the more one obeys the superego command, the more one feels guilty. And I think that's something that's really interesting to keep at the front of the mind when we're thinking about how these wellness practices and sites of wellness function socially. Finally, and in the same vein, Sederstrom and Spicer say, when wellness goes from being a general idea of feeling good to something that one ought to do in order to live truthfully and righteously, it takes on new meaning. It comes an impossible demand that reconfigures the way we live our lives, obsessively tracking our wellness while continually finding new avenues for self-enhancement leaves little room to live. So these are some of the critical questions that are driving our engagement with the sociology of wellness, and something that we hope that drawing together scholarship in this area can begin to address. So we're so excited to have you here today, and thank you so much for coming and joining us on this little journey. I'm now going to hand over to Claire to give you a little bit of information about how we're going to run the timing and the questions before our first presenter begins. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi, for that beautiful introduction. And now I'm going to give you the business end of today with my exciting pink timing card. So we're so excited to hear all of the fabulous papers that are on the lineup today. So as you'll know from the program, we've given you a 20-minute slot, which includes 5 minutes for questions for your papers. And in order to do that, I do have to be the time master of today, keeping you to time. So when you've got 2 minutes left in your 15-minute slot, in your 15-minute presentation time, I'm going to try and get your attention by waving this very bright pink card. So I'm going to keep my camera on during your talk. And when you've come to your 15 minutes time, I'll wave it again. And hopefully then that'll give you time to kind of quickly wrap up, and then we'll go to questions. But if you do run into your question time, we'll just kind of cut your question time a little bit shorter. And everybody who is speaking in the next kind of chunk of time should now be a co-host, but if I haven't been able to find you and make you a co-host, we'll make you a co-host so you can share by the time it's your time to talk. And I'll be muting everybody so that when the presenters are talking, nobody else is kind of chatting or making noise in the background. But without further ado, I will introduce our first speakers. I'm not going to do very long introductions because those are always a little bit awkward, but I'm going to introduce Shakira and Teresa, who are talking about the far right and the ritualization of food, which is going to be so exciting. So take it away, guys.
Thanks so much for that introduction. I'm Dr. Teresa Leclerc, and I'll be presenting with Dr. Shakira Hussein. I'm coming from the land of the Chumash people, and Shakira from the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And when I wrote this presentation, I was a lecturer in digital politics at the University of Melbourne, although I'm currently in the United States and no longer working there. But yeah, this is some of the research that I was doing at the time. So as we stated in our abstract, though discourses of food may seem innocuous, they may serve as a vehicle for ideological messaging. And there's been growing concern over far-right discourse entering the online wellness space. Although one would think that diet that is as meat-heavy as the Paleo Diet and a pure vegetarian diet are in opposition, these can provide valuable insight into how far-right ideology operates through diet. And of particular interest is the overlap between more extreme dieters that deem foods as impure or unpalatable, and the racist discourse of the purity of whiteness, and how this can serve as a gateway for recruitment. So we're going to look briefly at two case studies. Shakira is going to be discussing Gao Rakshaka, and I'll theorize how the far-right ideology has managed to find some appeal amongst paleo dieters, particularly the ways in which beef has been framed. And I'll take a look at the Sacred Cow kind of documentary by paleo cookbook author Diana Rogers. So we're interested in the ways that these serve as gateways for more extreme ideology, thus operating as potential means of recruitment. So this presentation arose out of a presentation at the Just Food conference with Scheherazade Bull, and we began to interrogate our case studies, and we noticed some intersecting parallels between them despite their apparent contradictions. So we thought about the ways in which far-right ideology asserts an idea of supremacy through food influencing, and we've categorized these initially into 4 different areas, which we'll return to in more detail later on in the presentation. So these are ritualization, a discourse of purity, Gastro Nationalism, and diet coercion or surveillance. So I'm just going to hand this over to Dr. Hussein.
Okay, thank you, Teresa. So under the Prime Ministership of Narendra Modi, states across India have passed so-called cow protection laws, which ban the production, sale, and consumption of beef, with penalties ranging from fines to life sentences. More dangerous still has been the rise of Gau Rakshas, or cow protection squads, which have targeted Dalits and Muslims for assaults and lynchings. Often described as vigilante attacks, these attacks are in fact highly coordinated, undertaken in collaboration with the police in order to win favor with powerful politicians. Hindu nationalists claim that the consumption of beef was forbidden to Hindus until the arrival of Islam in the subcontinent, despite historical evidence of beef consumption dating to the Vedic eras. And abstinence from beef consumption has always been most closely practiced by high caste Hindus, particularly Brahmins. For Dalits, so-called untouchables, beef has always provided an affordable source of protein that may stand between them and starvation. Dalits and Muslims may also earn their livings, livelihoods in slaughterhouses and tanneries. Along with this claim of historical genealogy, the beef bans are also enforced through what is described as the most modern scientific methods. For example, the use of beef detection kits developed by a government-funded lab in Maharashtra, which can supposedly distinguish cow from buffalo meat, and have been provided to police units throughout the state. And other surveillance measures include cattle universal identification numbers and cameras in slaughterhouses. This is claimed to provide protection to suspect communities so that innocent people are not lynched. There's high consumption of milk among high caste Hindus, and also large volumes of milk used for ritual in Hindu temples. Yamini Narayan and others have highlighted how, from an animal welfare perspective, it is not possible to draw a distinction between the beef and dairy industries. Where dairy cows are not slaughtered for meat, they die slow and painful deaths from neglect once their production productive lifespans are at an end. The dietary restrictions have recently been extended in some areas to imposing restrictions on meals provided in schools, eliminating not just meat, but also eggs, onion, and garlic. Parents say this leaves their children dangerously deprived of protein and nutrition more broadly because their offspring find that the pure meals unpalatable. But the authorities claim that actually they are supplying children with the healthiest meals available. You would expect this ideology to have limited capacity to cross national and religious borders, but in fact, fantasies of Aryan brotherhood between Hindus and Europeans have a very long history. And in this slide, we see the photo of such as Savitri Devi, the 20th century Greek fascist who spied on the Allies in India and claimed that that Hitler was an incarnation of Vishnu. Devi was a proponent of a strict vegetarian diet for Aryan bodies. And we can also see in the background an image of the black sun, the fascist symbol that became notorious recently when shared online by Pete Evans. Back to you, Tressa.
Thanks, Shakira. Okay, so, lost my place. So although we think about the paleo diet today as originating around 2002 with the publication of Dr. Lauren Cordain's book, The Paleo Diet, its origins can actually be traced further back to 1975 with the publication of Dr. Walter Boglin's self-published book, The Stone Age Diet. But according to Johnson, paleo leaders today have largely disavowed Boglin for his white supremacist, eugenicist, and generally unpalatable politics. While studies find that the paleo diet can be nutritious, and it's important to acknowledge that modern food practices are worthy of critique, the rationale of the paleo diet itself is that the human body isn't compatible with certain mass-produced foods like grains and pulses and dairy products, and modification practices like food processing, and that these are the cause of many of the modern medical conditions. So what does the paleo diet include? Definitions vary, but fruit and vegetables and fish and nuts and eggs. Meat features as a key part of the paleo diet, although there are vegetarian versions as well. But the beef must be grass-fed or pasture-raised rather than eating a grain-based diet. Proponents of the diet argue that the way beef is farmed is, quote, not natural, and they advocate for free-roaming and foraging cattle. Johnson reports that men are the presumed target audience for paleo books due to their descriptions like warrior or protector that convey a strong, heroic body. However, one survey by the Ancestral Health Society found that more women than men practice paleo. So I'll discuss how the paleo diet's deeply ideological. It creates a nostalgia for the past that's reconstructed as a place in which people were fit and healthy and had better bodies. And in this narrative, our present society is plagued by ill health and obesity and sickness due to our change in diet. Instead, it places an emphasis on real foods, which are arguably the foods that are included inside of the diet. And the suggestion is that the others are impure. A recent study of AltRight YouTube videos found that the AltRight can serve as a gateway to radicalize followers, or the alt-right can serve as a gateway to radicalize or kind of progressively become more extreme to the alt-right. So I think this is interesting to examine how these ideologies overlap with diets such as the paleo diet. Because the idea that I just mentioned regarding the paleo diet of, the imagined and idealized utopian past and the dichotomy between purity and impurity is also found in far-right rhetoric. The past in far-right discourse is one in which whiteness and largely men were in positions of power, but have been robbed of their dignity by waves of immigration from non-white countries. And the threat is the other, or immigration. And when we hear the far-right, we tend to think of the alt-right. And we can point to a few thought leaders and publications like Breitbart, but the alt-right, like the paleo diet, is one that's based largely online. While the terms continue to evolve, I've placed some characteristics of the alt-right and the alt-right here. And the split was marked by some proponents feeling that the alt-right white nationalist sentiment, particularly of Richard Spencer, was too extreme. However, as you can see, the values are very similar. And the alt-right tend to use a branding that's framed with the language of positivity and also social justice, much like neoliberalist self-help and diet movements. And Ma found that the alt-right tend to similarly promote multiculturalism while emphasizing white dominance and implied superiority. So it invokes like civil rights discourse to present an image of whiteness as marginalized in order to dodge accusations of racism. And one interesting example is Jordan Peterson's support of the Paleo Diet, which Sika has defined as a diet dominated by meat. But while it may have started as paleo, Peterson takes this to the extreme. He stated that he eats a diet of only beef, known as carnivory, and his daughter, Michaela Peterson, is a blogger, influencer, YouTuber, and podcaster that promotes the diet. This narrative also creates a kind of ritualization. As Haviland points out, there's a kind of ritualization in depriving your body of certain foods. And similarly, Gresher found that the paleo diet contains an embedded moralism that filters into constructions of food as either pure or polluting. An example is the paleo narrative regarding beef and how this can be found inside of the film The Sacred Cow, which is a documentary that doesn't explicitly state it promotes the paleo diet, but it was created by paleo book author and influencer Diana Rogers. And it's also one of the documentaries featured on paleo diet guru Pete Evans' streaming and multimedia platform, the Evolve Network. In this documentary, while mass-produced meat is criticized, vegetarianism and mass production of corn, wheat, soybeans, and use of GMOs and pesticides are the perceived enemy. And it argues that meat has been unfairly characterized and is a scapegoat for processed foods. As a matter of fact, one documentary interviewee even frames vegetarianism as a kind of devolution. And that's interesting to consider when we think about the name of the aforementioned, quote, Evolve Network. Some people are framed as more evolved, e.g. kind of superior. In effect, we get with the far right and paleo diet what's referred to as red pilling, where information is framed as altering someone's worldview or opening a person's eyes to an alleged false consciousness of liberal thinking. So this is something we see more in modern conspiracy theory, like QAnon, but I've also got a quote on the screen here, and I think it's interesting to consider when we consider the idea of Gastro Nationalism. So this term is credited to Michaela De Soucy, who examined the concept in the context of the EU through the morally objectionable production of foie gras. It delineates how foods constitute cultural and material resources that affect and respond to political agendas. And this becomes more interesting when we consider the online and media spaces in which fidelity to national foods are communicated and propagandized. The power in a national food like foie gras, which is objectively an unethical production practice of force feeding a duck, sometimes to death, to continue despite moral trespass, speaks to the power of national rhetoric to not only sway public opinion in direction that may cause people to commit acts of violence that they may not otherwise, but to impact what people consume or put into and do with their bodies. Consider this with respect to white nationalism. Dr. Hussein examined an anti-halal Facebook group to discover that actively eating foods that were considered anti-Muslim or against Muslim values served as a form of nationalism to far-right posters. Thank you. The aspect with Gastro Nationalism we're concerned with then is its ability to manipulate the behavior of large groups of people in the name of fidelity to a nation. In doing so, it exercises a worrying amount of influence over its followers. So what ties these together? So we can see the alt-right functioning as a gateway to more extreme right-wing views. Though people may engage with the alt-right content without becoming radicalized, it still serves to fuel racist sentiment. In turn, the paleo diet's overlap with alt-right ideology also may function as a method of recruitment. We contend that right-wing recruitment operates through food using a variety of frames, and these are deeply ideological. One way is through ritualization. It stresses a paradigm shift in consciousness and a secret group that symbolize the forces of evil. So that us versus them mentality. And this is brought into the dialogue about food through its ritualization. In part of an ideological diet like the Paleo diet or the vegan or Hindu diet, and these impart and display ideological values. And there's a campaign and framing of purity versus impurity. Those that adhere to the foods described are considered, quote, real or, quote, pure, and all others are subordinate or even dangerous. And there's an ethos of multiculturalism as long as that multiculturalism is through assimilation. So Western values, for example. So there's an attempt to regulate the diet as well. And we can see this through the Hindu groups and or dietary guidelines that suggest not following them will lead to disastrous consequences. As such, we can see that no matter the actual food consumed, meat or no meat, through its framing, food is used as a vehicle for ideological messaging. And I'll leave it there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for that beautiful presentation to get us started. There's so many ideas there that I'm just absolutely so excited to discuss, and I'm sure there's lots of questions. Does anybody want to get us started with a question for Teresa and Shakira? You can raise your hand using the little emoji, or you can just unmute yourself if you want to jump off. Lots of love in the chat, which I always love to see.
My Zoom name is false advertising. Sorry, from the previous conversation.
I did. I mean, I like to see it. I like to see a little. I feel like sometimes I should change my Zoom name to make it a little bit more festive, a little bit more fun. Yes, good point, Naomi. Feel free to put your questions in the chat. I'm very happy to read them out. A dramatic reading, if you would like. Oh, we do have a question. We do have a hand up.
Hi, Anna.
Hi, Shakira. Great to see you again, and good to meet you, Tressa. I guess my question is, it's a brilliant paper, and we're presenting next, and there's a lot of intersections. So the gender dimensions, if you can speak a little bit more on your insights pertaining to that, like how male dominated do you feel this kind of paleo far right gym culture is, and what's the involvement of women within it?
Yeah, we were actually talking about that. Yeah, I'll let you go.
I'll say just quickly that although it's supposedly built around the defense of the mother cow, the Garakshas are highly patriarchal and very because it serves as a vehicle for male displays of violence and virility. And anyway, but I will let Tressa take over again. Tressa.
Oh yeah, I mean, like, yeah, it's an interesting one to talk about because we've got like white nationalism and alt-right, and those are also deeply kind of very misogynistic in their ideals and values. When they create the hierarchy, it's usually white men that are at the top, and then white women. And so it's really interesting to consider when we think about the paleo diet and maybe sorry, I'm getting notifications, and like for example, pastel QAnon and the radicalizing kind of value of women inside of the domestic space, because as Shakira was saying before about sort of like far right movements and women, there's also the value, I think this is in one of your papers actually, Shakira, there's also the value of women within the domestic space and bringing this sort of diet and food inside of that domestic space to bring in white nationalist ideology there as well. So women are very valuable to that sort of recruitment process because they bring it into the family.
Yeah, that's such an important discussion, because it was definitely something that I was thinking about when you were talking. It's like it's such an important thing to talk about the underlying ideologies here, because we tend, like you say, we tend to think of these as kind of very recent trends, but of course, as you say, they have these really long histories, but of course these incredibly complex politics, and the gendered aspect is such an important one.
They've also provided a means of a home-based income for some women who set up little businesses providing pure, actually in the United States, going back to providing kosher-free domestic products. Really guaranteed pure.
It's so interesting to think about how that aligns with other kinds of religious movements like Mormonism, for example, where women have constrained economic opportunities. So get invested in multi-level marketing schemes and things like that as a way of being entrepreneurial in the domestic space within these incredibly patriarchal frameworks, which I think has a lot of synergy with what you're mentioning in your observation there. So I think it's fascinating to see how this connects across a number of different domains.
Did anyone else have another question? Well, I think we
take that as a compliment that it was actually very clear, because I was feeling like I jammed too much in.
We can also circle, sorry, Claire, we can also circle back at the end as people kind of digest and perhaps see linkages between the papers. So, you know, you can put it in the chat for later if it occurs to you, you know, in a couple of minutes, which sometimes happens with my brain too.
Yes. And it, you know, it is early in the day, but I thought it was incredibly clear. I feel like it's kind of, yeah, that's going to stick in my brain for a long time. So let's move on to our next exciting paper, which is, we've got Anna and Emily talking about conspirituality and wellness and COVID-19. And you should have the ability to share. So take it away, Anna and Emily.
Thank you. So thank you very much to the organisers. And I am on Wurundjeri land and Emily is on Wathaurong land today. So I'm going to start things off and then we'll go between the two of us for the presentation. And Emily's on the slides, I think. Okay, so the spread of disinformation about COVID-19 has occurred at a rapid pace, including in Australia, in parallel to the virus, in a globalized, marketized, and hyper-mediatized world. Adherents of conspirituality are among the many engaged in the spread of problematic disinformation during the pandemic. In this paper, we identify 12 conspiritual convictions and discuss the process of radicalization and potential for violent extremism occurring within spiritual and wellness movements. And I'm sorry, the previous slide outlines the project that this research is has come from. It's together with a group of people, and Alex is in the Zoom room today, so I want to acknowledge her as well as and the other CIs. Okay, so spirituality, like religion, is a contested term. When we refer here to conspirituality, spirituality and wellness movements, we are looking specifically at what is termed holistic spirituality, equated with alternative New Age spiritual and wellness groups and industries focused on health, healing, and happiness, rather than a broader contemporary spirituality, which also encompasses many religious forms, practices, and communities, which holistic spirituality often draws on and or appropriates. Holistic spirituality also differs from Indigenous forms of spirituality and knowing, although, as Naomi mentioned before, holistic spirituality also often draws from and appropriates Indigenous knowledges, often in problematic ways. Religious and or Indigenous people may also identify as and be part of holistic spiritual movements. So contemporary spirituality, holistic spirituality, and Indigenous spirituality can be overlapping at times. So we stress in our research, drawing on Inga Furseth's framework of religious complexity, that we've also revealed very much a spiritual complexity in and beyond Australia. So Charlotte Ward and David Voas were the first scholars to analyze conspirituality, and they proposed two core conspiritual convictions. This is back in 2011, that a secret group covertly controls or is trying to control the political and social order, and humanity is undergoing a paradigm shift in consciousness. In our research on conspirituality science and the COVID-19 pandemic in Australia, we have identified an additional 10 key convictions, including those that result in vaccine hesitancy and or refusal. And we've applied our analytical framework of 12 conspiritual convictions to a sample of Australian conspiritualists who sell conspirituality, and also we discuss one particular influencer who has been attempting to counter this from within the wellness industry as well. So moreover, due to the internal complexity of responses within spiritual and wellness movements to the COVID-19 pandemic, we choose to bracket the con in conspirituality to problemize this term and to point to what we call, drawing here on Scott Appleby, the ambivalence of spirituality, namely its associations with violence, both direct and structural, and also with peace building. This has been highlighted by scholars such as Andrea Jane and Francois Gauthier as well more recently. So we argue that our study may provide a deeper understanding of conspirituality, which may also assist with developing more effective strategies for countering the spread of disinformation, anti-lockdown protests, threats to authorities, and vaccine refusal within spiritual and wellness movements. And over to you, Emily.
So Thanos Panayiotis is a former reality TV contestant, and he was one of the most prolific Australian conspiracists. His Facebook group 99% Unite became one of the biggest hubs of resistance against the coronavirus responses. Neil Pascoe, also known as Nate Max, and Tom Barnett are other popular Australian conspiracists and wellness influencers based in northern New South Wales. Panayiotis and Pascoe and others were labelled as Aussie warriors by the New Earth Project, which regularly hosted online discussions in 2020, including 3 that were focused on Australia. So our analysis illustrates our 12 conspiritual convictions with quotes and content drawn from a since removed conversation among Panayiotis, Pascoe and Barnett, featured in a YouTube video, which was hosted by Panayiotis and live streamed on and recorded on the 14th of August 2020, which was during Victoria's second lockdown. It also features Jason Christoph, who's a Canadian health, wellness and fitness coach, and he's also featured in the broadcast. So briefly, a more detailed description of the 12 convictions is going to be published in our forthcoming special issue on conspirituality, which is arising from this project. But the 12 convictions are: 1, those ushering in the new age; 2, those wielding the new world order, which results in 3, cosmic war with spiritual warriors defending and strengthening their spiritual tribes in opposition to mainstream culture, particularly big pharma, mainstream media, and polluting industries. So in the YouTube discussion, Pascoe claims that the COVID scandemic isn't real and it's only being held together by the mainstream news and fear. He states that we're being poisoned by our food, the air we breathe, the toxicity in our drinking water, the phone tower frequency. Pascoe further exclaims in an anti-Semitic tirade that it's actually the CIA, it's the Israeli intelligence, it's Mossad, it's the Zionists behind this pandemic. And the only thing that's stopping us from building heaven on earth is a bunch of pedophile Satanist puppets who are controlling things from the top. Pascoe adds that I'd like to do it another way, but we're in a war now with half humans, a spiritual war with the cabal, the deep state. It's taking your time, your energy, your vital life force, your chi and your soul's essence. He calls listeners of the live stream to rise up against the elites, get out in the streets. What are you fighting for? Our planet, our freedom, our sovereignty. Fight for the earth, fight for humans, fight for all of us. Later in the live stream, Pascoe also states that alpha males do not have the balls to take on the system. The Aussie warriors, by contrast, are doing so, emboldened by narratives of exclusivity, of secret and suppressed ways of knowing, drawing on ancient utopic wisdom oriented to both the past and the future. Conspiritualists also exhibit white privilege in their spiritual bypassing of reality and suffering of the pandemic, and also in their cultural appropriation of Indigenous and Asian religion and spirituality. They prioritize authenticity and autonomy, gut feelings and intuition over rational scientific facts, which all fuels their vaccine hesitancy and or refusal, where vaccines are seen as toxins that are poisoning their pristine bodies. They spend considerable time influencing by evangelizing others to see things the conspiritualists' one and only way, by selling conspirituality in a marketized and hyper-mediatized world in order to raise their statuses for financial gain. They also increasingly engage in sciencey spirituality that both co-ops and critiques science and technology to strengthen and spread their claims, how and when it suits them. Sciencey spirituality and essentialized gender norms and hypermasculine narratives calling men to spiritual war seem to be elevating men as leaders within and drawing more men into these conspiratorial movements. To illustrate, Pascoe states, they don't want you knowing that you're a god. Barnett simply argues that the internal knowing that we are more than what we are ever told that we can do is coming from a place of this inherently godly power. Conspirituality in Australia is evident among more privileged and often white individuals and groups, given the largest Australian holistic spiritual communities around Byron Bay and Noosa in Australia are coastal, affluent, regional locations. They also tend to be dislocated and insulated from much of the impact of the pandemic in 2020 and 2021. Often this occurred in larger cities affecting culturally diverse communities, and more recently Indigenous communities in cities and inland Western New South Wales. This helps to explain how Pascoe can pontificate that there's empty hospitals, there's fake death certificates, the list goes on and on. So if you use your eyes, your ears, your mouth and your senses, you walk outside and you're like, what pandemic? Pascoe instead calls for a global meditation as he has his chi master sorted, and because that's something that works, it's scientifically proven that we can co-create a new reality and we can win this. He mobilizes the listeners. Let's co-create, co-create, co-create. The first step is you need to know you're being mind controlled, and then you need to know how to break the mind control and how to start living for yourself and doing your own things, making your own decisions and being a sovereign being. He further instructs the listeners that the best thing you can do is go out there and share this to as many people as you can. And I'll hand back over to Anna now.
So our study reveals a spiritual complexity within spiritual and wellness communities, evident in the 12 conspiritual convictions, their supporters and decriers. While the profound impact of the global market and economic factors within conspirituality certainly need to be acknowledged, we question the likelihood that most conspiritualists and wellness influencers are primarily or solely motivated by financial reasons, as has been widely argued, despite the widespread financial precarity within their industry, but rather that this conviction to sell conspirituality is blended with other strongly held conspiritual convictions, as illustrated by the Aussie Warriors discussion. It is also overly simplistic for scholars and state actors to tar all spiritual and wellness communities with the same woo-anon or militant wellness brush of going down the irrational rabbit holes of QAnon prophecies and anti-vax sentiments for profit. There seems to be a more militant paleo gym subculture linked to the far right, as Tressa and Shakira have just discussed, than just conspirituality. And as Margrieta et al. Note in our upcoming conspiritual special issue, the aesthetic and lexicon of the far right and QAnon are quite different to that of holistic spirituality, broader wellness movements. So highly problematic aspects and overlaps with the far right and QAnon are disturbingly present within the paleo gym subcultures and within conspirituality, as evident in the quotations from the Aussie Warriors, but are also intertwined with quite rational and legitimate concerns regarding environmental degradation and unhealthy consumption. Decolonization theories and processes are increasingly being applied to the study of religion and spirituality and to crisis events such as climate change and COVID-19. So growing environmental and social justice awareness is, in fact, posing threats to certain polluting industries and elites. So this global awakening is not entirely fabricated. But why then has a global coronavirus pandemic, which scientists argue is linked to the encroachment of humans on animal habitats and environmental degradation, resulted in so many within holistic, spiritual and wellness communities literally buying into conspiritual rhetoric, rather than seizing this moment to intensify their environmental and social activism and genuine world repairing activities? So our study argues that this latter approach is much more long-term and difficult, particularly given it faces greater opposition by neoliberal far-right and authoritarian actors who are fueling the QAnon discourses and far-right discourses and also vaccine debates to destabilize societies for their own gains. In addition, people are currently preoccupied with immediate fears regarding their health, their economic situations and personal freedoms in a time of rising precarity as a result of neoliberalism. And this is largely, and also COVID-19. And so this is largely marginalized climate change activism during this crisis. And perhaps this is the greatest con of neoliberalism and populism, and conspiracists seem largely unaware that they themselves are being played. Our research also queries to what degree we are also being distracted by sensationalized media and scholarly preoccupation with the potentially dangerous and violent aspects of conspirituality, rather than paying more attention to the non-violent and beneficial lived and everyday ways people are turning to holistic spiritual and wellness practices such as yoga, conscious dance, meditation, and alternative medicine to support themselves during the crisis. Moreover, if we can better understand the complexities and dynamics within conspirituality, including vaccine criticism, hesitancy, and refusal, we may better be able to counter its dangerous aspects. Rather than simply dismiss all who participate in alternative practices as woo-woo, it seems that another way forward would be to work with counter-conspiritualists, wellness influencers, and celebrities who are willing to address and challenge QAnon, far-right, and other conspiritual elements within their communities. So finally, these influencers, such as Australian Sarah Wilson, author of I Quit Sugar, respect scientific evidence that the benefits of vaccination outweighs its risks and are likely to have a more positive effect on encouraging vaccine uptake in spiritual wellness communities than medical and state authorities who evoke mistrust among them. Other strategies that use more affective rather than scientific messaging, such as pleas from alternative vaccine refusers who have caught and suffered from COVID-19 for others to be vaccinated, or wellness mummy influencers to protect children, may also be more effective. A key aspect of spiritual lifestyle is freedom and mobility, so urging vaccination in order to travel again may also increase the vaccine uptake. So we conclude that the large amount of those declaring themselves to be spiritual in Australia, which is around 40% of young people, are likely to have been exposed to conspiritual and anti-vax views. But as with many social movements that have religious and/or spiritual ideologies among their drivers, those with extreme and dangerous views which may incite and or lead to violence, such as at protests or against state or medical authorities in future, are more likely to be a small but still disturbing minority. It's therefore important not to conflate broader spirituality and holistic wellness communities with conspirituality, and instead aim to better understand the internal diversity and complexity within conspirituality, including its underlying and at times legitimate grievances, as well as the process of radicalization occurring within these circles. So in doing so, it may be possible to address the threats posed by conspirituality with more success in partnership with spiritual community leaders and wellness influencers.
Thank you so much. That was so thought-provoking, and I can already see some really exciting crossover between our first paper. Does anyone have a question to start us off?
Sorry that we ran a bit over time with that one as well.
There's already so many things that spring to mind. Do we have anyone question, or shall I start us off with one of my, we've already got a question from Edith. Edith, do you want to pop in and ask your question?
Hi, thank you both. That was so interesting. I have a quick question about, so the 4 men that you were talking about, when you mentioned like the monetization, I was really curious about how those 4 specifically, and I guess individually, are benefiting from that that group? Do they do stuff together? Because I'm not familiar with the four of them. Do they have like a podcast? Do they do other monetizing things that they profit from in their activities together?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's changed a lot, actually. So Fanos, as Emily mentioned, had this website, 99% Unite, that has been documented in several studies as being one of the most prolific. So at that time, he had a lot of influence, but then his platforms actually have been shut down. And apparently, I don't know, I was told recently that some of his, and we have to look into this, like in terms of the more recent developments, that some of his attempts to monetize things further have not been particularly successful. But someone like Tom Barnett, his influence actually seems to have grown over the past couple of years. He hasn't been deplatformed. And so Nate Max and Tom Barnett are still kind of active as wellness, people within the wellness industry. So again, it's a sort of complex. Some people seem to have successfully monetized, or at least initially, and then it's been impacted sometimes by the platforms being closed down, and or just maybe how much influence or charisma these individuals have also kind of plays a role. We should mention we're sociologists of religion, so a lot of our theory comes from sociology of religion. So things like charismatic authority obviously is a factor there too.
Yeah, I will just jump in as well and just say, so Fanos, even though he got deplatformed on Facebook and Instagram, he is on more alternative types of, Telegram, Rumble, those sort of things. And he's actually made merchandise with some of his like key quotes and things like that he's been releasing during, or what did release during the pandemic and things like that. So, he's trying to monetize in that way. Not too sure how successful it is, but it's like $30 for a cat.
Classic.
So
yeah. Thank you so much for answering.
Yeah.
That is so interesting. Naomi has a question, but I might have to rudely say that you might have to hold your question for later in my supreme powers as timekeeper. But we'll have plenty of time for chit-chatting over our leisurely lunch break, where everybody is free to move on, but also to stay and chat. So we might move on to our next exciting paper, where we have Ashley, and I think Ashley is going to be presenting, but we also, Ashley's co-authors Jay and Rob, talking about COVID-related disinformation, conspiracy theories in online wellness communities, dominant discourses, implications, and sites of resistance. Which sounds absolutely fantastic. And Ashley, you should have the capacity to screen share, I hope.
Yes, I do. Thank you.
Fantastic. Take it away.
Get cracking. And oh my God, the overlaps, but without being too similar to the last two presentations are great. Okay, so can everybody see that okay? Yes, sweet. Okay. Good morning. My name is Ashley Hoare, and I'm a research fellow in sociology at Deakin University. I'm joining you today from the unceded lands of the Boon Wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, as well as First Nations, any First Nations people who may be present today. I'm presenting on behalf of a team that consists of myself and two colleagues at RMIT in Media and Comms, J. Daniel Thompson and Professor Rob Cover, surrounding COVID-related disinformation in online wellness communities. But so it overlaps a little bit with the last presentation, but we're focusing more specifically on those kinds of sites of resistance and the kind of theorizing these around resilience. And so there's definitely some synergy between the themes, and it's going to be a hard act to follow. But I should also clarify, we're not talking about any one particular research study. We've worked together on a co-authored book that I'll plug at the end. And so we've pulled a lot of information and theory and arguments together from various pieces of work and pieces of research we've all been involved in. So it's very emerging ideas kind of paper that we're going to expand upon for some more work as well. So to get started, a key, as we've already established, this key dimension of unintentional misinformation and intentional disinformation is this reliance on the nourishment of troubled times and social unrest. And so here we see crises become fertile ground for the spread of false information. And in the case of COVID-19, there's been an abundance of disinformation campaigns and conspiracy theories circulating in both traditional media and also social media in what the World Health Organization famously labeled as an infodemic, based on just the sheer amount of information and conflicting information that we're receiving. But an important component of all of this is how the broader public discourse on the issue plays out against this backdrop of low trust in elite institutions, where we see this generalized skepticism toward most of the actors that dominate the contemporary information environment. And this can lead to what Mark Davis from Uni Melbourne refers to as anti-public publics. And it's when people are standing in opposition to the so-called mainstream thinking, expressing disdain for traditional modes of expertise. So for instance, the medical establishment, which we sometimes hear colloquially referred to as big pharma. But in some cases, you see this rejection of all or most aspects of this kind of traditional public sphere discourse. And essentially where this deeply held mistrust of expertise and of formal institutions and authority intersects with social upheaval, you've got this perfect storm for a communication crisis where really dangerous misinformation and disinformation is running rampant. And so for many, terms such as misinformation really do conjure up these images of these conspiracy theory chat forums and so-called Russian bots. But this alarming amount of it is reaching audiences in the health and wellness realms, as we've established from the previous presentation. But the wellness movement was initially emerged in the 60s and 70s in the US as actually part of the counterculture. And in this context, wellness meant equal access to healthcare, especially for those who have experienced marginalization by the medical establishment. But today, wellness culture has also given rise to an industry of self-appointed lifestyle gurus who are combining advice about health and nutrition with this kind of self-development and new age spirituality, and sometimes or often for monetary gain. But this online industry is highly unregulated and relies quite heavily on personal testimonials and anecdotal evidence, which does make it susceptible to unsubstantiated claims, especially where we're seeing personal truths elevated over expert opinions and these kind of anti-public publics that we talked about before. And this results in compelling stories of self-transformation standing in for professional expertise. And as we've seen in the case of COVID, there are a lot of social media influencers who are focusing on these, who focus on natural remedies, holistic health and new age spirituality, but are also now sharing content that peddles a lot of false claims about the veracity of vaccines, just as one example, but in some cases sharing alternative and natural cures for COVID and peddling products in that sense, and also voicing outright denial that the virus even exists in some extreme cases as well. And also as highlighted in Anna and Emily's presentation, the kind of post-rationalism and institutional mistrust that leads people to kind of turn to online wellness communities in the first place is often also at the center of populist anti-establishment and conspirituality movements such as QAnon. And as you can see in the example on the screen here, that's just some of the language in this post by Byron Bay influencer Sally Mustang draws on the kind of liberal individualist ideas that we routinely see in content shared by the likes of QAnon and other anti-establishment movements. So, but also another kind of troubling part of where wellness and conspiracy theories and misinformation is kind of overlapping is this fixation with the so-called kind of natural or detoxed body, which is another real staple of wellness culture, but also lends itself to narratives that demonize immunization, which is then seen as a pollutant. So here, just to speak back to the conference theme, the non-vaccinated body is touted as the better body, so to speak. And, you know, you can't blame people for wanting to engage with communities that are, you know, at least claiming to be very much focused on optimizing health and wellness and well-being. You know, we all want that ultimately to some extent, that sense of community, but also to feel our best. But aside from the examples we've seen, how are influencers tapping into this climate of disenfranchisement that really underpins these disinformation and misinformation movements? And there are a couple of ways that we argue that this is kind of playing out. And so one is that you see this sense of everydayness where misinformation and disinformation is coming from a source that feels like this knowledgeable friend of a friend, because there's so much relatability in the way that influencers connect with their followers. And so, but this can make this information seem like this useful new intel. And we're seeing this happen through personalized messages to followers, this kind of love bombing language where there's a lot of personal pronouns, we, our, us, and this really strong sense of community. And it imbues this image of a united group bound in their pursuit of truth. And in this kind of like, almost like a search for justice and emancipation from what's been seen as a really, what some people are calling this kind of totalitarian regime of control, just for one example. But another way it kind of happens is by embodying this authenticity that also kind of comes across in this sort of hero narrative. And here there's a strong sense of a person who's really living their truth and going against the grain. And that's very appealing to people who have lost trust in those more traditional conventional institutions and are feeling isolated and kind of cast out of the so-called mainstream society. And it makes the kind of ideas and services peddled by these true to self influencers more compelling, and understandably so. But also another way is by performing what Crystal Abidin, who is an Australian researcher in influencer studies, calls visibility labor. And this is where we see influencers quite carefully package their content in a way that disguises the true nature of it and kind of reels in audiences through these visually appealing and self-aggrandizing imagery and text. And just as a side note, because we mentioned the Great Awakening as this kind of example of the kind of language we see here, this is commonly attributed to the online conspiracy movement QAnon, but it's also not uncommon to see similar sentiments in the anti-vaccination and COVID denialism narratives that are circulating. So things like wake up sheeple probably comes to mind as a good example of that. But also just when we unpack these dominant ideas and the kind of the stuff that we're seeing, not just in anti-vaccination, but also in like the anti-mandates, anti-lockdown rhetoric as well. So one example being my body, my choice. We see this strong undercurrent of this bourgeois individualist rhetoric that perhaps ironically kind of disregards the inextricable links between individualism and the further oppression of the most vulnerable people, and the very same people that the wellness movement was actually designed to advocate for initially. And so we don't have much time to go into detail about this today, and there was so much great content on some examples of the way this is playing out in the previous presentation, but we do want to focus a little bit more about how this kind of individualist thinking is being countered by influencers who have opted to take an anti-disinformation path, and how that's ultimately connected to resilience as well. So to start with an example of someone who's still kind of using an individualist approach, but in a way that's pushing back, is Dr. Michael Mrozinski, Australian GP, who debunks mis and disinformation under the TikTok and Instagram handles Dr. Michael Says. So his posts provide really concise and easy to understand chunks of information in the form of videos, photos and memes that are often humorous in tone. And as you can see, he's got quite a large following already. These numbers are as of February, early February. But he's a good example of a sole actor using a digital platform to resist disinformation. But as I said at the beginning, his approach does rely on this primarily conventional practice of content producer and audience, rather than this kind of collectivist community approach, which is important considering the significance of intimate publics in fostering the kind of resilience needed for positive engagement with health information. And so when we talk about resistance and resilience in this context, they have often been treated as mutually exclusive concepts, with resilience seen as this kind of form of compliance with neoliberal and institutional norms. But we argue that resistance is actually quite a significant foundation to, resilience is a significant foundation to resistance. I lost track of which word I said there, so I wanted to make sure I said the right one. But as some wellness influencers who resist mis and disinformation face really strong adversities such as marginalization, exclusion from other wellness communities, being banned, humiliation, hostility, trolling, abuse, resilience becomes such an important aspect of their capacity to continue the important work of challenging mis and disinformation. But a couple of, in terms of theorizing resilience, we've kind of contrasted two really common approaches here. The psychological approach, which was kind of popular in the 1980s and is gaining maybe a little less traction now, but you still see remnants of it, focuses on this more individual experience and kind of pathologizes people who are not able to use the resources at their disposal. And so, but it fails to focus on processes of social production and real structural issues at the heart of whether, why one person can bounce back from adversity better than another. And so for that reason, resilience really is, it is individualizing a structural problem and is therefore, we argue, not as useful to us in today's climate. But by contrast, a social ecology approach really does regard resilience as more of a product of the interaction between individuals and their environments. And that unlike the psychological approach, it's multidimensional in the sense that it doesn't completely ignore our individual circumstances and traits, because those are important to how we're going to cope, but also really does look quite strongly at those structural factors as well. And therefore, in this context, this kind of social ecology approach to resilience, to resist mis and disinformation in online communities, is much more of a significant and relevant way of looking at it. And the reason for this is we argue that resilience frameworks that take a more individualist approach reinforce those same kind of underlying issues of kind of transactional care and wellness that are embedded within misinformation and disinformation campaigns in the first place. And so a more collectivist social ecology approach that favors a framework that's more based on mutual care is more aligned with the ethos of fostering the resilience that people need to be able to combat the spread of disinformation and conspiracy theories. Thank you. And we've seen some really good examples of this already happening, with some influencers demonstrating this kind of resilience through networked discourse and the sharing of anti-disinformation resources. And so with COVID and QAnon, for instance, we see a lot of, we see this through the sharing of memes and images, some of which are about debunking false claims, but a lot of it is actually focused on kind of showing solidarity with followers who are feeling similarly, really down about the discourse and the kind of state of things, understandably. But there are just some examples, and these were all on the official Instagram page of the Conspirituality podcast, which I highly recommend. And I've included the details and handles for in the bottom right corner. It's really, really good. But just as you can see here, some of these posts are very much about us coming together, and this is what we stand for. We stand together against disinformation. But then there's also some stuff that's kind of directly saying, hey, this is not this is not good information. So it's a little bit of a combination of those two approaches. But ultimately, it is kind of about banding together with followers and seeing it as kind of us kind of working together. But just before we wrap up, I did mention at the beginning that a lot of this has been pulled from a recent co-authored book that I've written with Robin J. And we're excited to announce that this book is going to be published on March 8. It grapples with very similar issues and some other examples as well. And we're planning some launch events and kind of talking about how we're going to, do all of that. So stay tuned and maybe get in touch if you'd like to stay updated. But yes, it should be available very soon, and it'll be a good one to order for your libraries. And I've included the publisher information there as well. Yes, thank you very much. I couldn't finish this without having a little tinfoil hat. But yeah, also recognizing that we're not, we don't want to pathologize everybody too much in that sense as well. But I look forward to your questions, and if you do have feedback or further things you want to follow up on, then I can be contacted here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for that. That's such a thought-provoking presentation, and really does show how many connections there are between that and the first two papers. So I'll open it up now for questions. But if there are no questions to begin with, I actually have a bit of a question, so I will sneak in before there are any other questions. But I wanted to ask you, you made a really interesting point that I've been thinking about a lot across the papers about the kind of history of wellness and where kind of what the original kind of intentions were of the wellness movement. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit to like I guess the kind of sense that we often have of wellness as a very contemporary thing and a very kind of new thing. And that was really raised in both the previous papers as well, the kind of history of actually the long history of wellness. And I wondered if you wanted to speak a little bit more to that issue.
Yeah, I'll give it a crack. And one of my co-authors, Rob, is here, so maybe he'll jump in as well at some point and expand a bit. But yeah, I remember that when I was researching that element of it, when we were putting the book together, and also just when I started to become really, really interested in this topic in the first place, I was quite surprised by that, because I had thought that wellness had kind of emerged sort of alongside this kind of digital revolution, so to speak. And then was quite surprised to find out that it's been around in various different contexts for a long time. And I do wonder if this spread and of information and the way that we access information now has had a very deep impact on how it has now shifted in terms of the kinds of ideas that it picks up and how much it overlaps with some some movements that are actually have a lot of rhetoric and a lot of kind of deep-seated beliefs that are actually completely in contrast with what wellness was initially about. And I would argue that, they impede wellness in a lot of ways, if that makes sense. And so I do wonder if it has a lot to do with the way that information is disseminated and accessed these days, and how easy it is to be publishing information that reaches massive audiences without actually having to be a journalist, and having to have your work, the claims you're making fact-checked quite vigorously before putting it out into the world. I feel like that's got to have quite a major impact, but at the same time don't want to overstate the role of digital media in that. But I'd love to know if Rob, my co-author, wants to jump in on that as well, because I know that he probably has a bit to say about it.
Super quickly, thanks, Ash. Yeah, look, for me, a lot of it around the wellness industry today is, and thinking about it, is trying to trace that genealogy that goes back to the 1960s, to the 1968 countercultural movement, to Greenham Common in the UK, and all these little pivotal moments, and in fact a lot earlier than that as well. Early 20th century, late Victorian era, German naturalist movement, and before that, all these little emergences that would happen during the Victorian era, and there are all these antecedents that lead up to today. But the one thread for a lot of them is distrust of certain kinds of institutions, and often rightful distrust. So you get this sort of fertile, well-soiled ground for another kind of distrust. There were moments in the late 80s and early 90s around some of the spiritualist elements. I'm thinking of, say, I can't remember who wrote it, but Dan Brown's horrible conspiracy theory books, what they were based on, book Holy Blood, Holy Grail. And there's a coinciding of the wellness adherents of the 80s and the people who are adhering and interested in this, as well as in the case of the people I personally encountered as a kid, alien conspiracy theories and so on. So these all come together, but that genealogical thread that goes back so far, I think, is a really important one, because distrust seems to be very much at the center of it. And it's how distrust is reoriented becomes the interesting topic for thinking about, well, how do we resist?
That is such an important point. And I think that we often get preoccupied with the idea of newness and kind of, that this event, especially when it is in a digital space, is kind of, that the cause is digital, versus looking back at that kind of historical trajectory. That's such a fascinating perspective. And also Anna has provided us some really fantastic resources in the chat that everybody should check out, so that we can kind of have a look at those. Well, we might move on to the next paper, and the next up is Claire Davies, who is talking about navigating health and food-related decisions online, a study in a sample of women in Australia. And Claire, you should be able to, there you are, you've already done it. you. Perfect. And take it away, Claire.
Thank you. So I'm the other Claire for today. I did get a little bit worried when Naomi was saying that Claire's going to take over, but no, thank God it's not me today. Hi, and thank you for joining me today. Can everyone hear me okay? Cool, great. My name is Claire Davies and I'm a PhD student at the University of Sydney, and I'm joining you from the land of the Gadigal people. My presentation, as Claire said, is on navigating health and food-related decisions online. And this is also part of my overall thesis project, which explores the role of digital technologies in shaping normative ideals of individual health and female embodiment. I want to also acknowledge that this research is conducted under the supervision of Professor Alana Mann and Dr. Alexander Jones, and Professor Mann also played a critical role in the work presented today. So sharing constructions of health and food-related practices online intersects with neoliberal ideologies where identity is enmeshed in food consumption and displayed through visual representation strategies. Positioning health as an individual's responsibility. Oh, sorry, I'm on share. So can you see my notes? No, cool. Been in one of those. You can see full screen. Yeah, cool. Positioning health as an individual's responsibility embraces the privileged who have the resources to prioritise their health. A good example of this is Steph Claire Smith, one of Australia's most popular influencers, who in this video promotes an overtly health-focused lifestyle with selling points such as the only competition is the one that you give yourself. So hopefully the sound works.
Not a diet, a lifestyle. Not for him, for me. Not for a day, but every day. Not to feel good in a dress, but to feel good in my skin. Not for a competition, but for the competition I created for myself, by myself, to become a better version of myself every single day.
So these social constructions of health lead to fitness and diet fads that promote common stereotypes and illustrate the female body as one that is in constant need of self-improvement.
Not a diet.
Considering the female body as material allows us to see how it is a product of biosocial processes that attributes and reflects meanings that construct embodiment and identity. When the body encounters digital technologies that promote the need to be better, whether that is for yourself or not, it denies female embodiment by promoting an ideal state of being healthy that affords users the capacity to make sense of their bodies through perceived self-care and activity. The extent to which health and food-related decisions are shaped through digital technologies is evident in the widespread adoption of new behaviours over the last 2 years. And these include physical distancing and lockdown measures, which prompted people to take up pandemic fitness practices, with lounge room workouts also becoming a route for escape in the everyday. Air fryers were the benchtop staple for those who had the means to own one and access the food to which to use it, especially as a hallmark for healthier cooking. TikTok brought back the manifesting trend into the mainstream, where users followed practices of attracting success through the power of thought and belief. Thousands of Australians downloaded Noom, which is the psychology-based weight loss app, which has recently received backlash for its focus on calorie restrictions and daily weight checks, which are also behaviours associated with eating disorders. And also an Australian study had found an increase in eating disorder symptoms, body image concerns, food restrictions, and binge eating over July to October 2020. The study highlights that eating disorders are an acute pandemic mental health issue, which has long-term impacts. These trends were supported by the results of our research. So the overarching research project recruited and interviewed 70 individuals who identified themselves as women aged 18 to 35 in Australia from March to August last year. Today, I'll focus on the experiences of 6 women living in New South Wales and ACT. The semi-structured interviews were designed to probe participants about their encounters with digital technologies, followed by targeted questions specifically exploring the participants' experiences relating to the health belief model variables. And these are the perceived susceptibility, severity, barriers, and benefits when exposed to health and food-related content through digital technology. But during our somatic analysis, 3 key health behaviours emerged and provide an entry point in explaining the complex micro-political encounters women face and how they navigate health and food-related decisions online. So JS Health described itself as a program which focuses on healing your body through nourishing foods, cooking intuitively, and balancing the mind. Women are encouraged to purchase high-performance vitamins for a range of issues such as hair, skin, nails, and bloating. Keep It Cleaner is a fitness app offering a workout program, a wellness hub, a run tracker, daily meal plans, and goal setting capabilities. And as many of you already know, a vegan diet involves cutting out animal products like meat, fish, dairy, and eggs. Our participants, however, noted that this plant-based diet was used for more personal reasons over animal welfare or environmental reasons. They also called out Simon Hill and DJ Tiger Lily as influential channels in their daily lives. And building on the last presentation, I'll also note that Sally Mustang also came through in some of their responses as well. In this research, we draw on the health belief model and feminist new materialism. By leveraging the 5 constructs of the health belief model, we assess how the participants make those health and food related decisions. We then use the feminist new materialism to provide that cultural perspective to behaviour, which helps us to take into account the social structures that determine the response and the participation in the material world. Due to timing, I'll present the initial findings from the last 2 constructs, which are the participants' beliefs and of the benefits and the cues to action. So starting off with the perceived benefits, which are their individual beliefs in the effectiveness of that course to action. The effective capacity of these encounters was evident in the participants' ability or lack of in identifying the benefits of their health and food-related behaviours. Most benefits were driven by a sense of knowing about their bodily function and the path towards achieving a superior level of health. Participants focus on the benefits of gaining a sense of knowledge about their bodily function, which was often prompted by an influencer or community group. The effective capacity of one participant's relational bond was evident when she outlined her steps following a recommended blood test after hearing about it on Simon Hill's podcast. Although she didn't have any concerns prior to following that recommendation from Simon Hill, she believed that she had benefited from being able to see the positive impact of a vegan diet on her body and what it means for her body in integrating those certain lifestyle measures. Another participant who also previously experienced disordered eating viewed her adoption of a vegan diet as a positive influence on her overall health and well-being, as she believed everything she ate would be considered healthy. This perceived benefit demonstrates discourses of healthism, where well-being is achieved by treating the individual behaviour, attitudes, and emotions as the primary symptoms, while diseases are seen as more complex and secondary. It also displays ideologies of nutritionism that undermines and even contradicts the relationship between food and the body. So where foods are reduced to the sum of their nutrient parts in order to influence consumer demand of how and what to eat. For example, cereals with extra protein or almond milk with added calcium are functional foods that are modified to offer alleged specific health benefits. A greater sense of benefits seem to be experienced by participants who are following the more strict dietary practices compared to the ones that were engaging more fitness-led practices. However, the benefits that the more fitness-led practices experience or participants had experienced was where one participant explained that she doesn't have to follow the Keep It Cleaner program every day, but likes knowing that you don't have to go hard every day, and what you do end up doing is better than doing nothing. The effective forces and relational bonds of these online communities within the programs surface as visuals that show very realistic and relatable experiences of others following the program. The participants explained that members of the group would share visuals of themselves struggling through a workout or sharing experiences that if they didn't feel like doing anything one night, then meditation would be enough. She said it makes it seem so much more achievable, and she started to recognize the benefits for herself. Likewise, another participant explained that she benefited from the Keep It Cleaner program as she just felt stronger, fitter, and got a good sweat on. On the cues to action, which are the motivations to follow through on that health behavior. The factors that prompted behavior uncovered important insights into the information and dominant actors that had greater influence among participants. Cues to action were attributed to a stronger relational bond that they had built with influencers, repeated messages and personal testimonials from others, and new routines as part of lockdowns. Effect manifests for participants as they actively participate and move through the material world. So one participant reflected on a chance encounter with an influencer, being Jessica Seppel, that prompted her to take up subscription supplements and a commitment to their online community, where she would regularly read and consume testimonials. Another participant shared a similar sentiment when it comes to the power of personal testimonials after being exposed to multiple messages on the supplements. She explained that seeing before and after visuals as part of these personal testimonials normalized the need to take stress and anxiety supplements, which she could relate to. A participant also signed up to the Keep It Cleaner program as she needed something to focus on during COVID lockdowns. So signing up and committing to the program was driven by the time and space to do it, and a new routine that made her feel that she was ready to take it on. Another noted lockdowns as a key event in joining the program for a second time. She commented that going into lockdowns meant you couldn't work out at the gym, so more or less had to work out from home. And she said that because the program is home-based, it means that she didn't need much equipment and she could get it all done at home. So it was interesting to see that both the participants following a vegan practice noted podcast influencers and documentaries as key drivers for taking up veganism, which is also consistent with previous presentations today. They believe that cues to action haven't always been in isolation and had watched a lot of documentaries, listened to a lot of podcasts, and then followed some people on social media about the topic before following through. The effective forces of human and non-human assemblages are important here, as we see the dynamic flow of interactivity, and which demonstrates how individuals become cultural products as a result of this encounter. So although the sample of this particular study is limited, the reported experiences of these 6 women attest to the fact that effective forces are both mediated and strengthened by social and economic structures that impact individual and collective identity, beliefs, attitudes, and opinions. The effective capacity of these encounters afford participants with greater knowledge, sensory experiences, and embodiment, validated through ongoing engagement with digital technologies. This creates a sense of digital intimacy where feelings of closeness and emotional attachments strengthen a sense of intimate exchanges with influencers and other program participants. Drawing on the theoretical strengths of the health belief model and feminist new materialism, we see these experiences that make visible the effective forces of the material environment that drive health and food-related decisions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. I always love hearing about your project because it's just fascinating to get a little window into people's lives. That was beautiful. So we already have a question from Naomi, like right off the bat. Naomi, would you like to jump in with your question?
I learned from my previous experience, Claire. Thank you so much, Claire Davies. Thank you so much for your presentation. I love that little nugget you put in there about TikTok, and I'm wondering if you think that there is something here about how wellness trends are kind of linked to this very quite strict idea of a routine in daily life. So I'm thinking about the 75 hard and how manifesting and these kinds of routine trends on TikTok are linked to main character energy and things like that. I was wondering if that dynamic had kind of surfaced in your examination of wellness practices.
So do you mean more so that it's the whole routine as in what I do in a day?
So the 75 hard has some very strict rules about doing the same thing every day. And when you see those girl boss morning routine, wellness routine things, it's it's about centering the routine as the thing rather than responding to what you might need on an individual day. Yeah.
It was it came through and even beyond the 6 participants in terms of what they see online or what they see other people doing, and taking that into account. Yeah. Girl boss culture is actually where I do want to like look into next. I have a thing about that too. But when it comes to this false sense of what women themselves need to integrate into their own lives, and because a lot of these conversations did happen during lockdown, there was a sense of guilt in a way for those who didn't have the economic means, didn't have the facilities to follow through with a routine that others would be able to as well. I also, there was also comes through the impact of living with other people in their household that impacts that routine. So there was a reflection on family, on children, on partners, whether that had a negative or a positive impact. It came through in some of their responses there, but it didn't. They always reflected on what they consumed online and what they hoped to achieve. But to your point, it wasn't necessarily what they have identified as something that they needed to for their own bodies or for their own health, really. I think there was, I think there was one participant that talked about Sally. She followed Sally Mustang's life because it was just simply a beautiful life to follow. She had a beautiful house in Byron Bay, and it was very visual of what life that she could do, which I was a little bit skeptical too. It's hard.
I mean, the life appears to be beautiful.
Yeah, it appears.
I'm sure she has some literally, piles of dirty laundry somewhere in the house, like all of us.
Someone's got to pay for it. So.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, what are the skeletons, like literal skeletons in her closet?
Yeah.
I don't want to think about it. Yeah, because that was going to be kind of my question, if I can be so rude as just to jump in over everyone. Like the kind of aesthetics seem to be so important, the kind of like how a lifestyle looks as well as at how it feels, and maybe even to some extent the look being as important, more important than how it feels. And that seemed to be something that you really beautifully were talking about just then. And we have a great question from Anne in the chat. What are your theory inspirations, Claire?
So in terms of my theoretical framework,
Anne, do you have a...
Yes, hi Claire, it's Anne here. I'm in Fremantle in West Australia. So congratulations on a really interesting presentation. So I'm just wondering about, as you said, your theory, Claire, and could you just tell us a little bit about it?
I was worried I didn't give too much airtime to the theory. So thank you for that question. So coming from my background is more in terms of in public health and building on the strengths of especially my second supervisor who's in this area. So the health belief model is a traditional public health model. It's used actually in a lot of health promotion activities. Even now, you could see some of the campaigns through COVID or through better eating with various ages. So the health belief model is more from an individual perspective. So it goes through the specific cues that are going to potentially impact somebody to take up a certain action. So it can be adapted in any sense. It could be adapted for someone's ability to take a COVID vaccine, or another one to take up a type of diet. But what we found with the health belief model in all its strengths, it didn't quite take into account the overarching structures that person might be living in. And that's what we could see through feminist new materialism, and how we could incorporate a more incorporate the impact of these encounters with digital technologies, but also the relationships around that person as well. So that's why we had combined the two together.
Oh, that's really interesting, Claire. Thank you. I didn't unmute then, and I've got a little parrot here who wants to contribute. So I'm trying to get him to be quiet.
It's quite nice to hear.
We welcome all parrot contributions as well.
We also have a little gecko that likes to walk in.
Oh, wow.
So this is a very well animal attended meeting today. And I'm sure the sociology of animals people would be delighted. I heard you talking about assemblages and so on, and I thought that might be coming from some of the Franco theory, some of the French theory, Claire. So thank you for going into that for us. I won't focus any more questions on that, but that is a really fascinating area, and I just get all excited and zesty when we're talking about theory. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you, Anne, for that zesty question. And everybody is welcome to have, zesty. The zestier questions, the better. I'm going to move us on to our next very exciting presentation. But thank you, Claire, for that excellent talk. So our next presentation is from Connie. And Connie is talking about a new theory of high-level wellness based on interviews with happy, healthy Australians. So Connie, you should have the ability to share your screen. Excellent. So take it away, Connie.
Okay, you can hear me now. Awesome, and you can see my full screen. Perfect. Okay, so today I'm going to describe a theory that I developed during my PhD and a more recent conceptualization of this data. And my supervisors were Professor Elizabeth Kendall and Dr. Jennifer Boddy. Sorry. So my study aimed to provide a new understanding of high-level wellness from interviews with everyday people who thought of themselves as having a high or very high level of wellness, health, and happiness. These people also lived in Southeast Queensland and were over the age of 18. In particular, my research aimed to discover what high-level wellness is and how people attain and maintain this way of being. I used a range of terms fairly interchangeably in this study, including wellness, well-being, health, and happiness, and participants were free to use their own words. So when I started this study back in 2013, I found very little literature on the lived experience of high-level wellness. Positive psychologists focused on wellness content, but generally prioritized quantitative research methods, despite several calls for a more balanced approach when the field was launched in the year 2000. Health researchers were more likely to use qualitative methodologies, but tended to focus on illness rather than health at that time, let alone wellness and well-being, leading Healy Ogden and Austin to say that specific research on the lived experience of well-being could not be found in the lead up to their 2011 study. The dearth of published research on the lived experience of high-level wellness prompted me to supplement journal articles with doctoral dissertations and books as far back as Maslow, right through to Brené Brown. Academic studies that enabled people to nominate themselves based on their lived experience of wellness, or whatever term they used, were the least common form of participant selection across the sources I examined, with none specifically exploring the term high-level wellness. As such, my study seemed to fill an important research gap. I adopted Sharmaz's constructivist-grounded theory approach to develop a new understanding of high-level wellness directly from participant data. I promoted my study through traditional and social media and received 41 expressions of interest. I accepted the first 20 people who were eligible and then chose another 5 to maximize variation in relation to the first sample. This resulted in 20 female participants aged between 25 and 65 and 5 male participants aged between 41 and 61, so 25 participants in total. I conducted semi-structured interviews with each participant, asking them to describe their their understanding of high-level wellness, their wellness journeys, what helped and what made it harder, how they were similar to and different from less healthy, happy people, and how others could become more happy, healthy, and well. They also reflected on the type of day that made them feel particularly well and the type of day that didn't. Each interview lasted between 35 and 259 minutes, averaging almost an hour and a half. The interviews were audio recorded with participant consent and then transcribed into 470 pages, around 300,000 words of data. Pseudonyms were used to conceal participant identities. I analysed participant data in 3 phases. In phase 1, I began while the interviews were still being conducted by undertaking initial coding, comparing data codes, categories and category properties in memos, and exploring data patterns with participants. In phase 2, I went back to the 2 research questions, developing a summary of each person's wellness journey, recoding the data to identify information that might help to explain what high-level wellness is, and crafting this information into a potentially generalizable definition. This was followed by selective codes and memos on several steps in a circular experiential learning process, as a way of testing my emerging tentative hypotheses about the data. This led to the development of theoretical process and model. In phase 3, I enabled participants to provide feedback on their wellness journey summaries and the wellness theory developed from their data. Participants suggested that my theory reflected their experiences and had the potential to help less healthy, happy people. They also provided ideas for improvement, which I incorporated into the process, model, and journey summaries. So the theory I created from participant data included a definition, process, and model, and rich qualitative data describing what this might look like in practice. This slide shows some of the overarching points from my PhD thesis. I called this version an experiential learning theory of high-level wellness and co-published a paper on it in Health Promotion International. According to this theory, high-level wellness is a sense of peace and well-being that comes from knowing, liking, and being who you are, your best self. Tuning into the presence or absence of this sensation prompts some people to move towards the people, places, perceptions, and practices that align with their values, needs, energizers, strengths, and joys, away from those that don't. There are 3 steps in this circular experiential learning process: assessing the situation, trying an action and reviewing the consequences, and integrating lessons. This self-initiated learning process is enabled through self-commitment, reflection on inner and outer circumstances, and the ability to become who you are, including access to relevant support and resources. People can initiate many learning cycles throughout their lives in relation to a wide range of factors. Over time, this tends to result in the adoption of several qualities and actions which people express in their own unique ways. People become the best version of themselves, feel at peace and flourish, while staying open to new opportunities to grow. My thesis has around 60 pages describing what each aspect of this theory might look like in practice based on participant data. I'll read a little bit now just to give you a sense of this lived experience. At its core, each person's explanation of high-level wellness seemed to denote a sense of peace, fulfillment, wholeness, and well-being, which arose from being and doing their best. Being and doing their best was not about being perfect or achieving other people's goals. It meant being present and self-determined, addressing their needs and embodying their unique array of values, strengths, energizers, and joys. Participants thrived when they understood, appreciated, and actualized themselves, and this pleasant way of being provided the energy, optimism, and self-assurance to lean closer to their truth, being more of who they were and doing more of what they loved. Bob illustrated the first part of this equation by saying, happiness is being satisfied with where I am in life, what I am, what I'm doing. Amelia explained the second. If you're feeling good about yourself and good about where you are in life, then you can achieve the things you want to achieve. Ongoing efforts to shape their lives around their favorite people, places, activities, and qualities enabled participants to feel good about themselves. They said that this way of being felt completely content and tranquil, warm and safe, devoid of any worries. Emma spoke of a nice euphoria, like everything's going to be okay no matter what, while Asia explained, you're in the most comfortable place, a calm place. Jill said, you learn to relax and that's the basis of being healthy, allowing your body and mind to heal instead of loading them up all the time. Rose added, you fall asleep with a clear conscience and you just feel good. These reflections suggested that being the best version of themselves made people feel calm and content, joyfully authentic and at peace. Over the last year or so, I've been trying to find a way to explain this theory to the general community in a way that's easier to remember. This is what I came up with. After reconceptualizing some of the data and working with a graphic designer, Lily West from Lily Creative, I started by trying to represent the breadth of things participants focused on in their wellness journeys. Everything from leaving abusive families to drinking green smoothies and spending time with positive people and pets. This is represented by the acrostic freedoms on the right-hand side of the page. Foundations, rest, eating, enjoyment, contentment, doing something of value, others, movement, and space, place, and time. I tweaked some of the wording in the experiential learning cycle and realized that it was essentially a cycle of trying things, a try cycle, and decided to incorporate a tricycle in the image itself with the experiential learning process embedded in the front wheel. The graphic designer helped me to represent all of these concepts in this image, including the definition at the top and the 3 enablers at the bottom right. This slide has some more information on the 3 stages in the tri-cycle process. This is the wheel in the previous slide. This information is also in my thesis, but I've adopted the headings of tune in instead of assess the situation, try instead of act and learn, and integrate instead of integrate lessons. As you can see, tuning in is about tuning into what's going on and how you feel, choosing to be happy, healthy, and well, seeing unpleasant experiences as catalysts for change, prioritizing activities that feel good and enhance well-being, and adopting scoping strategies to focus on issues that can actually be addressed. The 4 scoping strategies that helped my participants to focus on actionable issues were not expecting anything to be perfect, not worrying about the past or future, not just focusing on money or material possessions, and not sacrificing their own well-being when helping others. Some people had learned these scoping strategies from parents and caregivers, but many had learned them the hard way through trial and error over time. Try is about starting where you are, which could be taking time out for a multi-strategy reset, focusing on one change at a time, or maintaining and tweaking something that's already going fairly well. There was a wide range of things that people could focus on, as identified in the freedoms acrostic in the previous slide and the examples on this one. Really, it's anything, whatever's going on. Integrate is about embodying the lessons learned through different learning cycles. Learning what does or doesn't work at different times can deepen your self-understanding, including an ability to separate yourself from your problems and recognize and address recurring challenges. This can help you to formulate a new wellness-inducing identity so you can further embody your energizers, strengths, needs, values, and joys. The participants in this study no longer describe themselves with words such as shy, overweight, trapped, unhappy, or exhausted. They'd learned to identify with empowering characteristics such as strong, confident, and resilient, values such as love, compassion, and kindness, activities such as runner, explorer, and artist, or attributes such as seeker and feelings person that help them to feel like their best or true self. Integrate is also about creating personalized systems to set yourself up for success, including finding ways to reflect on your experiences, needs, and wants, letting go of unhelpful people, places, activities, perspectives, and things, cultivating supportive relationships, scheduling time for activities that make you feel happy, healthy, and well, living, working, and reviving in wellness-promoting environments, and developing empowering insights and mottos to guide daily practice. The tri-cycle high-level wellness theory seems to be original, credible, resonant, and useful in line with Sharma's grounded theory criteria. It supports some ideas in the literature, including other qualitative studies denoting wellness as a feeling of inner peace. It also provides a new way of conceptualizing the personal experiential learning process and lots of contextual data on what this could look like in practice. Potential next steps could include testing this theory with individuals and communities in a range of contexts to see if it could prompt people to design, implement, and evaluate their own wellness learning journeys. This could help to swing wellness endeavours towards honouring who we are, rather than striving to achieve mainstream perspectives of perfection. However, there's a danger that this theory could make high-level wellness seem a lot more simple and achievable than it is in practice. In terms of reflexivity and my own experiences, I started this research not knowing what high-level wellness was in a personal sense, or even if it was possible. I spent many years immersing in wellness literature, data, programs, and practices, but I've often found this way of being unobtainable. During my PhD process, in wellness jobs, and when taking time out to rest and recover. Personal quests towards self-understanding, acceptance, and actualization don't happen in a vacuum. We need new understandings of high-level wellness, opportunities for everyday people to voice their needs and wants, and systems to provide relevant supports, including positive changes to housing, social welfare, incomes, employment, policies, and services. We need a genuine commitment to high-level wellness at all levels of society and ongoing care for ourselves and each other. This could start with a few key questions. What is high-level wellness for me as a person? How can I attain and maintain this way of being? And what is high-level wellness for us as a whole, including our communities, organisations, governments, and planet? How can we attain and maintain high-level wellness for all? The World Health Organization says everyone has the right to enjoy the highest possible standard of physical, mental, and social well-being, what I'm calling high-level wellness, regardless of their socioeconomic circumstances, ethnicity, or beliefs. I've learned that this is not just about preventing disease and reducing healthcare expenditure. It's about prioritizing deeply fulfilling lives, honoring who we are at our core, and creating the types of resources, systems, and supports that enable everyone to flourish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Connie. That was fascinating. And it's really interesting to hear your perspective looking at wellness more from kind of how individuals define their own wellness. And we've heard a lot of kind of wellness as a kind of representational thing, which is such a fascinating perspective. Now, do we have any questions from the audience? Let's have a look. We already do have some really interesting reflections in the chat. If anybody from the chat would like to ask their question, or I'm very happy to read out some of the reflections. There is a really interesting comment from Cassandra about the relevance of Foucault's kind of techniques of the self. Cassandra, did you want to?
Oh, no, when I was just listening to Connie then, I was just thinking, oh my Lord, this is about ethical mediations of the self. And I just thought of a quote. I'm so sorry, because being a theorist, I'm going to read it. I actually dug it out when I was listening to her. And Foucault said, when he was in the history of sexuality, he was talking about the ethical mediations of the self, by which technique do I have to use in order to live as well as I ought to? And he said a critical ontology of ourselves involves the deployment of particular technologies that permit individuals to effect by their own means or with the help of others a certain number of operations on their own bodies and souls, thoughts, conduct, and a way of being, so as to transform themselves in order to attain a certain state of happiness. And happiness, I keep on hearing through and through these papers. So that's why I threw it in.
Yeah, that's very interesting. The way that happiness becomes a sort of like a goalpost to sort of that we should sort of modify our lives to obtain. That's very interesting. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing.
I have a question. It's Anne, if you've got time.
Yes, pop in, Anne. And the parrot is also welcome.
He is here. I'm wondering how old your participants were, Connie.
Yeah, they were between 25 and 65. And these were everyday people, not influencers or anything like that.
Because it did strike me as I was listening to it that that's a very young person's perspective of a healthy body, and a very abled person's perspective of what is health and ultimate, what's that word, uber wellness. Were any of your participants have a disability?
Yes, quite a few did. There were people with MS, there were people with chronic pain, there were people with, a range of different life experiences that were really tough, as well as like experiences in their body. And these were their reflections on, their sense of wellness. So it was their sense of wellness in relation to themselves, not necessarily an aesthetic of what wellness looks like or might look like.
Okay,
Thank you for your question.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially the idea that sort of having a sense of wellness that's very personal, rather than like what we see a lot from an influencer perspective is much more wellness as a prescription for others. And that's a really, really important distinction. Anna, did you want to ask your question?
Oh yeah, just quickly, I'm interested. It's really fascinating data, Connie. Thank you. I'm interested in the fact that it seemed to be very secular, non-religious, and yet talking about, as a sociologist of religion, themes that I would have equated more with spirituality and religion. So I'm interested whether, is that because your participants didn't really mention spiritual or religious dimensions, or is it more that the sort of discourses around particularly well-being and wellness are quite secularized?
I think I was looking for patterns in the data and what people had in common. So there was definitely people who spoke about their religions and spirituality, but not everybody did. So I guess it didn't come out as a particular theme that I focused on. Yeah, but some people talked about even, nature as their sense of spirituality as well. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting.
That is really interesting. And I think there's really interesting themes that kind of go across like all of the papers, even when you have kind of more what we might think of as like the influencer perspectives on wellness versus the kind of everyday perspectives, that there are still things like kind of spirituality or religion that people experience both at an individual level, and then I guess what we might think of as kind of like macro kind of sociological levels. Thank you, Connie. That was so fascinating. We're going to move on to our last paper before our leisurely lunch break. So we have Alexandra and Rebecca, who are talking about I Felt More Like Myself, Wellness, Wellbeing, and the Use of Medicinal Cannabis in the Advanced Cancer Context. So you should be able to share your screen. Excellent. Thank you. And over to you guys.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. What I will do is turn off my video. I'm regional. My internet is sporadic. So now that you've seen me, I'll disappear again. So thank you for the welcome, Claire. Today I'm joined by Rebecca Olsen from UQ. I'm also here today in my capacity as a research associate with UQ. I have some other roles, but not today. So today's presentation is, just checking that that's still sharing, that's great. Today's presentation is situated against a background of increasing public and medical interest in cannabinoids, also known as cannabinoids, depending on who you speak with, and their potential role in treating a number of conditions and symptoms. So in this context, the concepts of wellness and well-being and the nature of the well body are variously malleable, medicalised, they're contested, they're often moralised. I think as we go along today, we'll also find some nice connections with some of those previous presentations we've had today, particularly considering that sort of highly contextualised, relative, personalised nature of wellness that Connie has just touched on in her presentation and the subsequent discussion. So today we'll provide some background to the qualitative sub-study we refer to as MedCan2, and we'll discuss the theoretical and conceptual frames that we've used to examine the data collected there. From here, we'll present some of our findings, and we'll focus in particular on patients' experiences and understandings of cannabis and wellness in the advanced cancer context. So we're sort of moving away from those, the happy, healthy, well people, I suppose, to a very different cohort in some respects. To conclude, we're going to discuss some of the implications of this work for sociological analyses of wellness and well-being, as well as for the conceptualisation of wellness in the medicalised context of clinical trials and research, which is a very specific, quite different context. And in particular, we wanted to gain your perspective on the analysis we've been undertaking and some of those theoretical frames that we've been applying. There we go. It's caught up. So there we go. So by way of background, the research we're discussing today was generated from a qualitative sub-study, and this sub-study is nested within the MedCan clinical trial. This was designed as a multi-centre, randomised, placebo-controlled, two-arm trial of escalating doses of cannabinoid preparations. Its objective, the trial's objective, is to evaluate the efficacy and the safety of these preparations for symptom relief in patients with advanced cancer. The qualitative sub-study that we've been focused on was looking at understanding palliative care patients' perceptions, beliefs, and experiences around medicinal cannabis. It involved semi-structured interviews conducted with 48 participants, And those participants were drawn from two distinct groups. There were the patients who were eligible for the MedCan trial and had consented to participate, and also patients who were eligible but had chosen not to participate. And we're currently in the late stages of analysis, and we followed an inductive and abductive thematic analysis approach for that. One thing to note is because MedCan itself, the trial, was a placebo-controlled study, it's not yet unblinded. And as such, neither the patients nor the qualitative research team know which study arm, placebo or active drug, the patients were randomized to. So unblinding will occur soon, and that will inform some further analysis, because we'll then understand which of those patients had actually received cannabis and which had received the placebo. I'm going to hand over to Rebecca now, and she's going to talk about the theoretical and conceptual frames that we've looked at for this project.
Thanks so much, Alex. So the research findings generated from this study that we're still kind of generating, they're really situated at this kind of complex intersection of clinical practice, complementary and alternative therapies, contested public perspectives, regulatory frameworks, and the lived and felt dimensions of individuals' experiences with cancer symptoms, as well as with the MedCan. So a really big challenge within the MedCan clinical research space is measurable improvement in well-being. At the end of life really depends on well-being's robust conceptualization and measurement. Before any intervention can be kind of approved, it needs to demonstrate that measured improvement in some kind of wellness. And concepts and scales that are usually employed to measure well-being, things like the WHO-5, the Edmonton SAS, they've been critiqued as kind of culturally and theoretically limited. They're often based on a kind of compartmentalized, very North American, individualistic, psychometric understanding of well-being that takes a kind of dualistic and deficit approach to thinking about emotions. That kind of conversation that we've just had previously in relation to Connie's paper about happiness, for example, also points out some of the kind of North American and perhaps English-speaking Western ethnocentrism within a lot of these scales that are designed to measure wellness, really focused on happiness, whereas perhaps some that were positioned more with Indonesian, Japanese, or Chinese participants might be focused more on calmness and peace. So against this kind of background, we've abductively drawn from three kind of theoretical and conceptual domains to explore patient perspectives. And we're still in this abductive phase where we're in the late stages of analysis, but we're really interested in expanding our theoretical kind of tools, and this workshop is going to be very useful on that front, and we look forward to engaging you in further conversation on that. But what we've been looking at so far is first literature on wellness and well-being that considers in particular differences between, on the one hand, kind of clinical frameworks that generally aim to measure and quantify well-being relative to highly specific disease states using standardized scales like the Edmonton Symptom Assessment Scale or Edmonton SAS I mentioned before. And then on the other hand, those critiques of the clinical frameworks based on cultural considerations, CAM perspectives, and those approaches that more often consider a kind of broader range of elements and embodied experience beyond the relieving particular symptoms. Second, we've been engaging with research on cannabis and cancer with particular reference to changing legal frameworks and public perspectives and individual patients' beliefs, perceptions, and understandings in this space. There isn't quite as much research in the Australian space, though, of course, Alex and I are involved in that area. There is a lot more that's been done in Israel and Canada, for example. And third, emerging scholarship that aims to conceptualize MedCan at this kind of intersection of wellness, morality, perceived efficacy, and quantifiable clinical benefit, such as a kind of key scholarship from Israel that you'll see referenced at the bottom of the slide, where MedCan's been available for a lot longer than what we've seen in Australia. this research really demonstrates the need to reconceptualize well-being in kind of chronic pain and end-of-life contexts beyond those really partitioned measures of symptom burden and mental health to include emotions, relationships, and social identity. As you can see from that title, a kind of restored self, that understanding of self and how that's implicated in these understandings of well-being in disease or diseased states. So overall, we're working towards a kind of applied and interdisciplinary understanding of wellness in this setting. And in terms of research directions and our kind of guiding question, when we approach today's presentation, we're really seeking to address some questions. And as I mentioned before, we're really interested in feedback and input following the presentation of some of our initial findings. In particular, how might we comprehend wellness and well-being in relation to advanced disease states? And how are emotions, relationships, and social identity incorporated in experiences and understandings of well-being and wellness? So this kind of research space is really about unsettling some of those accepted, received notions of wellness and well-being, how it's attained, achieved, assessed. Is there something about the nature of being in a disease or disease state that unsettles those prevailing notions of wellness and prompts further consideration and integration of things like emotions, relationships, social identity? And what does this give us? So I think the organizers, you've done a really good job in positioning us after Connie, because we can see some intersections, but also divergences that are fruitful for our discussion. So I'll pass it back over to Alex now, who will talk about patient perspectives using some data extracts. Oh, you're on mute, Alex.
Hello. I got my video going and it's working, but I can't unmute myself to save my life. So I was saying, thank you, Rebecca. So the data extracts we'll be working through today, presenting today, broadly encompass, I guess, three fairly broad key points or perspectives. You've got perceptions from patients of the medical efficacy or the symptom relief they expect from Medcan, medical cannabis, which are aligned with more clinical frameworks of efficacy and well-being. Then there's a bit of a shift into perceptions of a broader sense of well-being, that sense of I feel more like myself, which are not necessarily aligned with those current clinical frameworks that Rebecca's touched on. And then there are those perceptions, beliefs, those understandings that are situated at that intersection. So where wellness is conceptualized in clinical settings, that symptom relief, lessening of pain, for example, but with reference to that embodied experience and the social and cultural elements of well-being, and how this is conceived in that broader sense. So patients are going through a process of sort of reconciling these two facets, I guess, in the context of their clinical trial, a highly medicalized experience. So to begin, we have a patient talking about feeling happy, feeling free, feeling an enormous sense of freedom, ready for anything that might happen. And they do talk about the pain, that it's had a good effect on the pain and on pain levels in general, but that there's also this sense of well-being, and that the great benefit for them of the medicinal cannabis is the sense of peace that it brings. And then they go on to say, it just depends on what you do with that sense. And they sort of touch on the point that they have terminal cancer, and yet there they are talking about having a sense of well-being, which speaks to that contextualized, personalized nature of wellness and feeling well. The next patient talks here about needing to be a believer, which also links into some of that wellness and well-being discourse, I suppose. You've got to try things to make your life easier, and if that's going to make your life easier, then yeah, I take it after dinner, I feel relaxed. So those notions of feeling relaxed, well, at peace. You know, when your body just winds down. When I'm relaxed, my body's relaxed, so I had no pain. So coming back again to reference some of that symptom burden and the connection of cannabis with that. The next patient here talks about chilling out, and you're definitely in a good place. They say, I don't think there's any tablet that can take the place of happiness or being contented or at peace, again, at peace with yourself, which is a better word than happiness, I think. And they say, I don't think that any tablet can achieve that or even aspire to achieve it, but marijuana gets close to it. You know you're nice and relaxed. This patient says, look, for a long time I didn't think it worked much, didn't have any obvious effect. And then I realized that it was actually knocking out the pain. So they've started at that pain, and then they've gone on to say, it's made me feel much calmer. It just makes me feel more rational. It's made me much, much more patient. So those broader but highly personalized kinds of concepts. Oh, let me go back. There we go. So those are the sorts of data extracts that we're finding are coming out time and again, highlighting those themes of highly personal and contextualized notions of wellness and well-being, and their interrelationship with that highly clinical, medicalized domain of clinical trials and the ways in which wellness are conceived, conceptualized, measured in that context. I'm going to, I believe, I'm just going to check my notes, hand back to Rebecca, and she's going to talk a little bit more about how the data that's been generated in this study might link into, possible implications of the research down the track.
Thanks, Alex. So our findings really kind of reinforce these critiques of those current tools I was mentioning before that are really well used in palliative care and medical research to conceptualize and measure well-being and wellness, especially in randomized controlled trials. Unlike the kind of multiple ontologies used to enact and establish atherosclerosis in Anne-Marie Moll's quite famous ethnography, what we see in this RCT is that the measurement of well-being is typically limited to things like symptom burden relief scales. But the findings suggest MedCan may improve well-being by doing more than kind of removing symptoms. Participants talked about MedCan introducing a state of well-being, contentment, peace, rationality, relaxation, freedom, that opened up possibilities for relations and concerns beyond symptom management. In short, and to kind of paraphrase that Israeli study we mentioned before, it opens up possibilities for being oneself. So scholarship on interdisciplinarity, and I'll thank Kara Brosnan for introducing me to this paper many years ago. It's referenced there at the bottom, Barry et al., may really help us in our aims and in kind of starting this work of a social science informed appreciation of wellness and well-being in this MedCan space with a possibility of a clinical application. As Barry and colleagues explain, disciplines discipline disciples. So interdisciplinarity is not just a kind of synthesis of disciplines being brought together in this MedCan project, but rather a space of differences, a multiplicity in which interdisciplinary research can be guided by other logics, in particular by the logic of ontology, where research is explicitly or implicitly driven, not only by the rationales of fostering accountability or innovation, but by an orientation towards effecting ontological change. So in this setting, there may then be intentions to reconceive both the kind of objects of research and the relations between research subjects and objects. So here fields are kind of intended to affect qualitative transformations, experimenting with and establishing new forms of practice that exist in an agonistic or antagonistic relation to, and that may destabilize existing disciplines and practices. So drawing on those kinds of quotes from Barry and colleagues, this helps us to understand what we're doing in this qualitative MedCan study. But it's also an opportunity to reconceptualize notions of wellness and well-being as they're experienced in PAL care patients in and outside of clinical context. And in doing so, more really incisively problematize existing approaches to measuring and enhancing patient well-being. So relatedly, our findings also highlight this kind of mind-body dualism underpinning current practices of using symptom burden scales to conceptualize wellness and well-being. This kind of affective sense of wellness as described by participants, that calm, happiness, contentment, even rationality, they're not separate to the individual. Following more physiological or post-positivist conceptualizations of emotion that position it as reactions to stimuli, threats to reasoning, or noise to be suppressed, these findings instead suggest they're embodied sensory states that are platforms that the self is kind of positioned on, and where a person practices and enacts us. So this is kind of pushing us towards more critical post-humanist understandings of emotion as kind of sociocultural mediator. So we've got to finish up there, and we want to finish up with just 3 questions to help generate discussion. Do you think there are theoretical and conceptual frames that might strengthen the analysis? Second, is this intersection of palcare, medcan, and clinical trials and the consideration and problematization of wellness in this setting novel, or do you see it as more kind of a well-worn path? And what are we missing?
Thank you so much. That is a great way to end with those like provocative questions. And I will open it now to the audience, who will obviously provide perfect answers to your provocative questions. Thank you so much, guys. I will do the little clapping emoji. Excellent. We already have a very well thought out question in the chat. Now, Monica, did you want me to read out your question, or would you like to ask your question in person, I guess, or in, if you don't jump in a second, I'll just read it out. I'll read it out. So Monica asks, Rebecca, I'm thinking about how your work using time sovereignty as a framework has shown that control over one's commitments is more important for how stressed one feels, rather than how busy a carer.
I think she means carer.
Oh, carer, with how busy a carer is. Hope I said that okay. And the connection with how some carers actually had a good emotional experience despite caring for a dying spouse. Do you think there is a relationship between medical cannabis use and a sense of control and patients' understanding of well-being? That sense of oneness or peace some participants described sounds like a very grounded, present moment kind of experience. It's a very beautiful question.
Oh, Monica, thank you. That's a really good point. Yeah, we need to think about how, control might be central to that sense of being oneself, that, having some control and not having pain perhaps be in control. Yeah, good point. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That is such a good point. And I really like the kind of beautiful contrasts and kind of complexities between the kind of everyday experiences, very subjective experiences of wellness that are quite different to kind of what we've seen in the earlier presentations of wellness. It's really beautiful. Does anyone else have any questions?
Yes, I do, Ash. It's a clumsy one, but if you've got a better one, go to the other person first.
No, you can jump in, Anne.
I'm sorry, I'm really struggling with this after listening to the presentations this morning, and I think it's going to be clumsy, but I've decided to be brave. One of the things I'm hearing is that there is a rejection of suffering and misery, and that we've got to be in another space where we're not miserable and we're not suffering, and our communities are not suffering and no one's miserable. And I'm struggling to understand how that can be, how to bring that into focus. I'm thinking vaguely of critical Buddhist studies where there is, as there often is in Buddhist philosophy and theosophy, an acceptance and an embracing of the suffering and misery that life brings to all of us, I would argue. But that seems to be out of scope for what we're talking about in this presentation and the last couple, that it's a rejection of the suffering and unhappiness. And we've got to, we must be somewhere else. We've got to be happy. I think I better stop because I need more time to think about it and get it into a coherent body of thought. But I'll just put it out there. And if anyone wants to talk to later about where in this work do we place the value and insight, the learning that comes to us as we embrace our suffering, maybe we can do that conversation another day because I'm not thinking it through clearly. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. That's a really interesting point. And Cassandra says how that suffering is experienced and contextualized is another question. And Claire, sorry, tell me if I'm stepping on your moderator toes.
No, go for it. Yeah. I think it's an interesting thread between a lot of the discussions we've had. Yeah.
Well, and I my immediate kind of response is to think about how suffering is pathologized within a happiness imperative kind of neoliberal framework, very much kind of connected and supported to the history of psychiatry and psychology. One of my favorite books on that is, of course, William Davies' 2015 book, The Happiness Industry, but also Ahmed's work on this kind of imperative of happiness and how, taking more of a critical Foucauldian thread and how happiness is really a means of controlling others. And I think it's very Western and English speaking as well. And I think these positionings of suffering on one side and perhaps happiness on another as balanced, opposing emotional and kind of self-reflecting forces perhaps could be part of this problem rather than more of an intersecting and spherical connection to thinking about suffering and calm and happiness as interrelated. Alex, anything you want to add in there?
Yeah, I mean, as everyone's been speaking, and I think Anne's question was certainly not clumsy. I think it was really thought-provoking, because as we've been working with this research, with this data, it's occurred to me that this particular cohort, this group of people have a very particular set of experiences, which from the outside looking in is almost entirely about suffering and pain and symptom burden and how that's measured and how that's treated. And it's a highly clinical space by dint of it being in that palliative care and obviously the clinical trial space as well. But it seems that by focusing on people who fully acknowledge and understand their current situation, their prognosis, the nature of their life, limiting terminal illnesses, the fact that they are in that end of life phase, it helps us to problematize the notion of sort of normative happiness and normative non-suffering. And in that way, it helps us to better problematize and sort of conceptualize wellness and well-being as something that is highly personalized. So I think, that was my sort of immediate response, is that these kinds of groups that so clearly are and look unwell, the ways that they conceptualize wellness have a real power, I think, analytical power in this particular space, and a way of unsettling some of those notions around happiness versus suffering. You know, there is potentially a way to reconcile those, that these patients, these people might have some insight to.
Yeah, that's a very good point about like being thoughtful and respectful of the insights of the participants, which I think both this paper and the previous paper were really beautifully highlighted, that we've been talking about not wanting to make people into kind of dupes. And I think that's a really good point. And I will let Naomi have a question, even though we are at time. I'm very generous, Naomi, you can have.
Yes, you are very kind and benevolent, Claire. So I was just thinking, as you were talking about this interconnection between like happiness and suffering, about what we know from fitness research with athletes, where athletes talk about going to the place where the pain is to get progress in some instances, or in managing, physical injury and pain in order to do what they want to do and get joy and happiness from it. So often we think that wellness is a state of non-pain and absolute happiness, but there's this tension where we sometimes have to be in or go to the place where there is pain in order to experience wellness or pleasure or joy or these other positive affectivities. So I really like how your research is kind of sensitizing that kind of dynamic as well in this end of life space. So that was more of a comment than a question, but it just what you made me think of.
Yeah.
Thanks, Naomi. And I think, you go ahead, Alex. You go ahead first.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, as Naomi was speaking, I was sort of reflecting on, I guess what we didn't touch on a lot was that research and literature and the experiences of people within the broader medicinal cannabis space. And that often veers very much into that, toxic positivity realm, you have control over your own happiness versus suffering and so forth, and use this product, it will help you to overcome all your hurdles. So yeah, it dawns on me that we could sort of explore that a little bit further, because certainly cannabis does not exist in this other space. It sort of aligns in many ways with some of those, the wellness, well-being discourse in more of the mainstream that we're seeing.
Well, that was a absolutely beautiful discussion. I'm sorry to cut us off, but we have run out of time and we are now at our lovely lunch break. But everybody is free to hang around and have further conversations, because I can't stop talking about wellness. It's an addiction, if I can pathologize myself. But thank you so much, everybody, for your morning contributions. It's been phenomenal. And our schedule says we are back at 1:10.
Yeah.
1:10.
Yeah.
So if you can come back at 1:10, that would make my day. But thank you so much, everybody. We have loved this morning, and have a lovely break and have something to eat. And yeah, feel free to hang around.